Alright, so you think that to go Lamrim or the
Good evening. So last time when we were together, we commenced with looking at the trainings that are shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity, having concluded those trainings that are shared with a practitioner of initial capacity. So building on those initial trainings, now we've come to these of intermediate capacity, whereby the various trainings are presented that lead to the cultivation of the mind of definite emergence, which is the mind that is intense, that is striving for liberation or freedom from the sufferings of samsara. We also then, last time, we looked at the meaning of liberation or freedom. So liberation refers to being liberated from, being bound within the suffering realms of samsara. So being liberated or free from uncontrolled rebirth in cyclic existence. When we talk about samsara, the samsara is experience, or the places in which one is reborn in samsara is presented in either being reborn in the desire realm, or in the form realm, or the formless realm, and within any of the subdivisions in any of these three greater realms. So the desire realm, for example, has its subdivisions of two God realms, as well as the human realm, and that of animals, spirits, and hell realms. And then the form and formless realms have their own subdivisions too. And beings who are bound or chained within the cyclic existence, they take repeated, uncontrolled birth and death in these various realms, in any of these realms. And these realms are differentiated in varying ways, but most commonly in terms of their degree of suffering or happiness. And those realms of the greatest mental pleasure or greatest happiness is that of rebirth in the form or formless realms. So these are experiences by far the most pleasurable rebirths. But even being born there is temporary, in that when the causes for such a rebirth are exhausted, death comes. And then one is very likely to be reborn in realms with far greater suffering than those. And this process of uncontrolled rebirth and death in cyclic existence, it comes about in dependence on causes. And those causes are contaminated karma and afflictions. So it is our contaminated karma and afflictions that ensure that we have no control over when we die, nor where we are born. In that, it's our karma that dictates when our death will come and when and where our next rebirth will be. This is not something we have freedom over, we have control over. Our karma dictates it. We do not have free choice over where we will be reborn. So this is the meaning of samsara, or in English, cyclic existence. It's this process of being bound in these suffering realms due to our contaminated karma and afflictions. Then the term liberation or freedom refers to being liberated from being bound in the suffering realms of samsara, and liberated in a way where one will never ever again be forced into a rebirth due to one's karma, but one is liberated from that. So the trainings here in this, in the trainings that are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity, they are trainings by which one trains one's mind to give rise to definite emergence, or most commonly translated as renunciation. But this mind of definite emergence or renunciation is a mind that is definite on emerging from the suffering realms of samsara. In other words, it is a determination where one is determined to gain one's freedom from these chains of karma and afflictions. If one does not give rise to this mind of definite emergence, one will not be striving for liberation. Why? Because one will remain here in samsara quite content, thinking that this is fine, especially the life we have is okay. This then means we will continue to remain trapped in these suffering realms. So therefore it's imperative that one trains one's mind to give rise to definite emergence, because it's only then that we will have the determination to gain our freedom. It's important right at the outset that one has a clear understanding of the meaning of the terms samsara, in English cyclic existence, as well as the terms liberation or freedom. So liberation refers to being liberated from taking uncontrolled rebirth in cyclic existence. In other words, our current situation is that we have no control over where we will be reborn, or it's not within our power where we will be reborn. We cannot choose. This is when I die, and this is where I will be reborn. Rather, our karma dictates that. That's why we have no freedom over where we are going to be reborn. But when one is liberated from samsara, one is liberated from this process of lacking freedom, lacking control, because one now has gained freedom, or one has gained freedom, and therefore this process of having no free will over where we will be reborn, one is now freed from that, liberated from that. So there are differing ways across Buddhist and non-Buddhist traditions, or differing methods to achieve liberation. So this term is used elsewhere too, not just in Buddhist traditions. So for beings who are still bound in cyclic existence, in samsara, they are born in one of the three realms and their subdivisions, such as in this particular world. When one gains liberation from a cyclic existence, one can be reborn in a Pure Land, for example. And one will have freedom over where one will be reborn. And one will not suffer again. In particular, if one is born in a Pure Land, that environment, being a Pure Land, is a land free of difficulties or challenges. For example, the world we're in, there are many natural disasters or bad weather, and in a Pure Land, one doesn't experience that. In our world, there's lots of diseases and illnesses that one can suffer from. These do not exist in Pure Lands. So to explain this term, Pure Land, it refers to a land that is pure because it has risen due to pure karma. And what makes that karma pure is that it is not tainted, not contaminated from by the afflictions. In other words, it's pure karma because it was accumulated and ripened without the engagement of the afflictions. So this is the meaning of Pure Land. So just to repeat that, it's a land that is pure because it has arisen due to pure karma. And that pure karma is karma that is not stained or tainted, but is rather pure. So it's not as tainted by the afflictions. The primary focus of this chapter is to develop this determined attitude of I want to gain liberation. So we have to make great effort to cultivate this yearning for freedom, for liberation. And once such an attitude has been cultivated, then we will have as the very focus of our life, our striving for liberation. So therefore, it's imperative that we cultivate this aspiration for freedom, that we cultivate this deep and abiding yearning to gain freedom from the afflictions and the contaminated karma that our afflictions create. So to develop this deep and abiding yearning requires an extensive presentation and deep inner reflection. So this is what is presented here and where we will continue looking at from now. So now we're turning to the text where we concluded last time. So at the bottom of page 154. So this has 2 points. So what has 2 points? We see the outline there. The methods for generating the mind striving for liberation. This has 2 points. 1, contemplating the faults of cyclic existence, the truth of suffering. And 2, contemplating the stages of involvement in cyclic existence, the origins. So that's second point. We'll come to on page 167, it's the next chapter, chapter 12. Until then, we're looking at the first point, contemplating the faults of cyclic existence, the truth of suffering. So we see in these two outlines, the truth of suffering and the origins, or the truth of origins. So this points to the primary topic here, which is the Four Noble Truths. It's through recognizing the Four Noble Truths that one will give rise to recognizing the Four Noble Truths, which is the method for generating the mind striving for liberation. That's actual outline. So the Four Noble Truths, so there's as just to say as a translator, noble, is actually the word for Arya being. So they're just the translators use the English instead of Arya being. So in, I think, a clearer way, instead of saying Four Noble Truths, is the Four Truths for Aryas. So that's just an aside. It gives more meaning to that term. But to talk about the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha taught them in his very first teaching, which shows its great importance. So his very first teaching, the first time he turned the wheel of Dharma, was at Varanasi, and there he taught the Four Noble Truths. The first being the truth of suffering, the second being the truth of origin, the third, the truth of cessations, and the fourth, true paths. And the Buddha in Varanasi taught that true sufferings are to be known, true origins are to be abandoned, true sufferings are to be actualized, and true paths are to be cultivated. So the first there, true sufferings, these are to be known. In other words, we need to come to know what is meant by suffering. We need to come to know it within ourselves, recognize it within ourselves. So this then is the first of the four truths for Aryas, the noble truth of suffering. So as you see from the first outline, contemplating the faults of cyclic existence, the truth of suffering. So this chapter now will present in great detail what is meant by the first noble truth, true sufferings. But just to talk about it, to give an introduction to what is meant by suffering. So it can be presented in different ways, but to present in brief, we can say there's outer and inner suffering. That which is external to our body and mind, and then our inner, our body and mind. So the outer suffering refers to the entirety of our environment, of our world. So this, by saying the world, it means the planet and everything within, but it's actually everything that we utilize, that is created or naturally arises in the environment. So everything apart from our body and mind. Our body and mind are referred to in this division as our inner sufferings. Or to express it in a more usual way, the body and mind, these will be our contaminated aggregates or our appropriated aggregates. So our body and mind, these are then referred to as the inner sufferings. The further way to understand what is meant by true sufferings is that it's anything that has arisen from contaminated karma and afflictions. So our entire outer environment, from the things that we utilize as well as the world and everything natural within it, has come about in dependence on contaminated karma and afflictions. Therefore, everything in our world is an illustration of a true suffering. So too, in terms of the inner sufferings, are our body and mind, in that these are contaminated aggregates, they are appropriated aggregates, and they have come about in dependence on contaminated karma and afflictions. Therefore, they too are a true suffering. So therefore, in brief, a true suffering is something or anything that has come about in dependence on contaminated karma and afflictions. To come to know suffering, so the Buddha said true sufferings are to be known, true origins abandoned, true cessations actualized, true paths cultivated. So to come to know true sufferings, one needs to look at the very essence of what is this, our outer world and our inner world, to come to know what its very essence is, and in reality what it is, its essence. In this way, we come to see that they are true sufferings. So if you have the book in front of you and you see these two outlines, the main one in the middle, page 154, and then the first subdivision at the top of 155, we see that the method for generating the mind striving for liberation is through, firstly, contemplating the faults of cyclic existence, the truth of suffering. So reflecting deeply on true sufferings is incredibly important, because this is the method by which one will give rise to a deep yearning for liberation from the situation we are in. And this is imperative because right now we are really blind to the reality of our situation. Our samsaric home, in other words, the state of our mind and our body and our world, it feels very comfortable, secure, safe almost, because we are so used to it. One needs to delve into this presentation in a personal way to really recognize how we misperceive reality, how what we perceive as being satisfactory or even pleasurable is actually naturally subject to suffering. So for example, if you're very happy with your car, you're not going to think to change it. You won't be interested in advertisements. You'll drive past dealerships. It won't draw you at all. If your car keeps breaking down, if it smells bad, if it's expensive to keep repairing it, you'll be thinking about replacing it, and you'll start to do some research on how you can replace your car. Why? Because you've seen the faults of it. Likewise, if a dear friend, you suddenly start to have regularly strong arguments with them, you're not going to want to hang around with them anymore, because that relationship, you now see it actually as not so reliable. This friend is not so reliable anymore. And you're going to want to distance yourself from them. Well, likewise, if you're regularly getting ill and you go to the doctor and it turns out you've developed a food allergy, when you truly recognize for yourself, every time I eat something particular, I get very sick. That same food that you've maybe enjoyed for many years, you'll now look at it with an aversion, because you'll know that just partaking in it will not lead to any happiness, but in fact, ongoing pain. So this is the recognition we need to come to in terms of our samsaric existence. And the first part, there's two sub-outlines. The first is through looking at true sufferings, because it's in this way we come to recognize that the term is contaminated phenomena. So it's anything that has arisen due to contaminated karma. So in our natural world, our created things, and this body and mind, anything that has come about in dependence on contaminated karma is naturally subject to suffering. And therefore, when we recognize that, we truly recognize that, an aversion will arise to this situation we are in. We'll want to be liberated from it, because we recognize that our environment, as well as ourselves, are contaminated due to the causes that have led to this. And we want to gain liberation or freedom from this situation. So this is how the deep yearning for liberation is developed through reflecting on true sufferings. True sufferings relates to everything that has arisen from contaminated karma. So I mentioned there's outer and there's inner. So the outer refers to everything outside of our body and mind. And then inner would refer to this body and mind in this division. So when one is engaging in reflection, in meditation on true sufferings, whilst one can reflect on the outer world, primarily one's focus is on the inner world. And here, I mean all 5 appropriated aggregates, the body and the mind. This is where our focus needs to be, not on the outer world, but on our own 5 aggregates, our body and mind. Firstly, we need to recognize how we naturally relate to our aggregates, to our body and mind, which is not in accordance with reality. We relate to ourselves as being permanent. Permanent as in unchanging. So the meaning of permanent is unchanging, not everlasting, but unchanging. So we relate to our body and mind as if it is unchanging. So perhaps hearing that you'll think it's a little strange, because we all know our body changes. Today I feel like this. When I was smaller, I was smaller, etc. So we do recognize, hang on, but how can you say I relate to myself as unchanging when I've certainly grown from being an infant to a child to an adult? So on a superficial level, we recognize our body and mind changes. But the way we relate to our body and mind is not as something that changes momentarily, but as something unchanging. This is why we think of ourselves as 5 years ago and now as being pretty much the same. Whereas when we think clearly, we know that, for example, our body on a cellular level has changed radically, and our way of thinking is changing every moment. But that's not how we naturally relate to ourselves. We naturally think of ourselves last week, last month, 5 years ago, as the same person. And likewise, when we make plans for our future, we think of how things will be in the future, we are thinking of ourselves as we are now, and we will be then. So on a superficial level, we can intellectually easily recognize that our aggregates change momentarily. But the way we innately or naturally relate to our aggregates is actually as if they are permanent. So this then we need to look at repeatedly to come to shake ourselves or break ourselves free from this natural way of thinking of ourselves, and come to recognize that relating to our aggregates as permanent is an error. Rather, our body and mind is changing momentarily. So our appropriated aggregates are illustrations of true sufferings. So our body and mind are illustrations of true sufferings. So last time I mentioned that suffering can be presented in various ways, various divisions. The most common, and we looked at it briefly, is that of the threefold presentation of suffering. So these three are the suffering of physical and mental pain, the suffering of transient happiness, and all-pervasive suffering of conditioning. So of these three types, it's only the first that is largely understood. The second and third are not. So the first of the three types of suffering is the suffering of physical and mental pain. So this is widely recognized. If one is experiencing illness, one knows one is in pain, for example. And there are many methods that people have developed to deal with this kind of suffering. So there's medicine and other forms of medical treatment, exercise, clothing for protection from cold, and so forth. So there's a lot that can be done to overcome temporarily the suffering of physical and mental pain. The second type of suffering, the suffering of transient happiness, or more literally translated as the suffering of change. So the suffering of transient happiness refers to things that we consider to be happiness. So everything that we take pleasure in, that we desire because we see it as the attainment of happiness, is actually an illustration of the suffering of transient happiness. It's not really happiness. So this second type of suffering is completely unknown to us. So remember, when the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, he said the first truth, true sufferings, is to be known. So of this threefold division, this first type, suffering of physical, mental pain, this to a large degree is known. But the second, the suffering of transient happiness, this isn't known at all because it's perceived as happiness. And the third type of suffering, all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, this we do not recognize at all. So therefore it is completely unknown. So when the Buddha taught that suffering is to be known, he was referring to these three types of suffering, of which only the first, the suffering of physical and mental pain, this is largely known. But the other two types are completely unknown, the suffering of transient happiness and the suffering of all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. It's through coming to know all these, in other words, to recognize what they are and the dominant role they play in our life, that we will give rise to this wish for liberation from these sufferings. We will give rise to a wish to be liberated from these three sufferings that have arisen from contaminated karma and afflictions. Therefore, it's these three sufferings that we need to know in order to give rise to a wish for freedom from them. Reflection leads us towards this reflection leads us to radically shake up how we relate to our aggregates, coming to recognize how deeply deceived we have been throughout this and previous lives. That the way we relate to our body and mind, our aggregates, is completely mistaken. We conceive of our aggregates as being unchanging or permanent, whereas in reality, they are impermanent. They are changed momentarily. We also relate to them as being pure, when naturally they are impure. Thirdly, what we relate to as happiness is actually in its nature is suffering. So these three recognitions, we come to these three recognitions in relation to our aggregates, recognizing how we misperceive reality completely, conceiving the impermanent as permanent, conceiving the impure as pure, and conceiving suffering as happiness. This process leads to a deep recognition that these aggregates are in the nature of suffering, that they are unsatisfactory. It is because we have these aggregates that we suffer. It's because of having this body and mind that we suffer. So when we recognize this, a repulsion towards these aggregates arise, recognizing that this is why we suffer. And this leads to the thought, why am I in this predicament? Where did this come from? And this then is how we seek out the causes or the origins of our suffering. What are the real or true origins of our suffering? And that is contaminated karma. And why is the karma contaminated? Because it was accumulated by a mind tainted by the afflictions. So therefore, the causes of our suffering, the origin, the true or the real origin of our suffering is contaminated karma and our afflictions. In particular, our afflictions, because it's our afflictions that lead to the accumulation of contaminated karma. Here, we now come to recognize this process that leads us to remaining bound in samsara and cyclic existence, that leads us to continuously circle in cyclic existence. We have no freedom. We are bound in these suffering realms, within these suffering aggregates, because of our contaminated karma and afflictions. Just before I translate what Ken said, so where we are is still at the bottom of page 154. We're talking about these two, the Four Noble Truths, in particular these first two. So to what Ken now has just said. So here we are talking about the presentation of karma And that is, we've just completed a detailed presentation on karma, where we spoke about what non-virtuous karma is, what virtuous karma is, and that yes, karma are causes that lead to particular results. And we looked at the ripening effects, and there are three ripening results or ripening effects of those karmic causes, whether virtuous or non-virtuous. For example, a rebirth in the lower realms, if the propelling karmic imprint was non-virtuous, and if it were virtuous, it would be rebirth in the higher realms. So we looked at that in some detail. So the terminology and what it means, this you have quite some familiarity with now. And this karma, whether it is virtuous or non-virtuous that we accumulate, comes together with the afflictions. This is most obvious with non-virtuous karma, but there is still a presence of afflictions with virtuous karma. This then is the second noble truth, true origins. Our contaminated karma and our afflictions are what keep us bound in cyclic existence. Because whether we take rebirth from virtuous karma or we take rebirth from non-virtuous karma, we remain bound in samsara, whether we're in the higher realms or the lowest realms, the high realms or the lower realms. As long as that karma that propels the rebirth is contaminated and is contaminated by the afflictions, we remain in cyclic existence. So therefore, both virtuous and non-virtuous karma is contaminated. So contaminated karma is accumulated by the afflictions. So the afflictions lead to the accumulation of karma, and the afflictions themselves, whilst there are many, have as their root one particular affliction, the ignorance of true grasping. The ignorance of true grasping is the root cause from which the other afflictions arise, and then karma is accumulated. For example, if it's non-virtuous karma, we may kill or we may lie. This follows from the afflicted motivation. And those afflictions arise from the ignorance of true grasping. So the presentation on true origins, or just to say as an aside, this word true, the meaning, it is the word for truth, so in the Four Noble Truths, the meaning is actually real or reality. So you can say true origins or the real origins, or true suffering or real suffering. So how it is in actuality. Back to what Genla said. So here in true origins, or the real origins of our samsaric existence, we recognize that we suffer because of the ripening of contaminated karma, which was accumulated under the influence or with the presence of afflictions, having as their root the ignorance of true grasping. By reflecting on this process of how karma, contaminated karma, is accumulated under the influence by, under the influence of the afflictions, and this is what leads to rebirth. One comes to a stable understanding of the process of rebirth or reincarnation. So that as one understands this, the presentation of karma and afflictions, that leads to a deeper understanding of the process of rebirth as well. This leads to a wanting to find out what is meant by this root cause of our suffering. So if one, through the prior presentation on karma, one will have an understanding of the role of afflictions, because this was presented there too. The role of the afflicted motivation in terms of the accumulation of non-virtuous karma, for example. But when we recognize that whether karma is virtuous or non-virtuous, as long as there is ignorance involved, that karma is contaminated, one comes to further recognize that the root cause of our remaining bound or imprisoned in samsara is the ignorance of true grasping or self-grasping. So it can be called different things. Ignorance of self-grasping, Geshe used now. So when we have at least an understanding that it's from this ignorance of self-grasping that the other afflictions come, and therefore the karma we accumulate is contaminated, and this, therefore, we continue to create causes that keep us bound in suffering. When we understand just that intellectually, we will know that by eradicating that root cause, then the entire process will come. Because if the root is severed, then the entire process ceases. Suffering ceases. Liberation from suffering is attained. So thereby, through understanding this well, one comes to recognize that by destroying, cutting the root cause, the ignorance of self-grasping, suffering ceases. But without eradicating that root cause, liberation from suffering remains impossible. So this then will lead one to have a deep inquiry into this mind of ignorance. How does it operate? How it says it's called the ignorance of true grasping, or the ignorance of self-grasping. So what is this process of grasping at this mistaken reality, so true grasping, or grasping at the self in a way it doesn't exist? What is this process? And how can I gain freedom from this? This leads one to come to understand selflessness. When selflessness is understood well, one knows that freedom is possible. That because selflessness is possible, or the realization of selflessness is possible, therefore one can eradicate the ignorance of self-grasping, which means self-grasping can be ceased, which means cessation from suffering is possible. There is a true cessation, or true cessation is possible. Reality cessation is possible. And this is how one comes to recognize liberation is possible. When one recognizes that liberation is possible, then a deep determined attitude arises for liberation. Because it's not just a theory one's heard about. It's not just a wish to be free from suffering, as strong as that may have been cultivated by recognizing true sufferings or knowing true sufferings. But when one recognizes that suffering can be ceased through realizing selflessness, a deep yearning for liberation arises. Then, for the practitioner, the attainment of liberation, and the attainment of liberation alone, is all that will dominate the mind. Nothing else will be seen as important. So this is how one moves from true sufferings to true origins to true cessations. Through this process of first coming to know true sufferings, or suffering in what is meant by suffering in reality, and then the true origins, the real origins of our suffering, and then coming to understand that those origins can be eradicated, they can be ceased, and thereby one will never suffer again. One comes to understand true sufferings, true cessations. And true cessations, one will come to recognize, is attained by abandoning the ignorance of self-grasping. Because it's through abandoning or eradicating the ignorance of self-grasping that liberation from the afflictions together with their seeds is attained. And when the wish to attain such a state, in other words, when the wish to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds and thereby be liberated from suffering arises in a manner that is uncontrived or spontaneous. In other words, now when we cultivate a mind, it tends to be contrived in that we intentionally manufacture it, we intentionally create it, we contrive it. When this determined attitude to emerge from the suffering realms of samsara arises in a manner that's uncontrived and sustained, then one has developed the spontaneous wish for liberation, which is called the uncontrived definite emergence. An uncontrived definite emergence, a spontaneous wish for liberation, this is a path. This is where one has attained the first path. Understanding all this, then immediately the practitioner will want to know, how can I achieve this path? How can I eventually bring my suffering, cease my suffering, bring it to a true cessation? This is where one will turn towards the true paths, cultivating the true paths. The true paths are primarily cultivating the wisdom, realizing selflessness, so as to sever, destroy, or cease the ignorance of self-grasping. And this wisdom realizing selflessness needs to be supported by other practices, namely generosity, ethical restraint, patience, joyous perseverance, and single-pointed concentration. So these 6, wisdom and those supporting 5, comprise the true paths, the actual paths that need to be cultivated so as to bring about a complete cessation of suffering, liberation from suffering. So tonight then I've presented an introduction to the 4 Noble Truths, or the 4 truths for Aryas. So the 4 truths are true sufferings, which the Buddha said are to be known, the true origins, which are to be abandoned, the true cessations, which are to be actualized, and the true paths, which are to be cultivated. So the way that I've been presenting it and the way that one trains is in relation to one's own lived experience. So when one engages in the meditation on the 4 Noble Truths, one is looking at one's own aggregates. One is looking at, for example, true sufferings in relation to one's own lived experience, coming to recognize how our aggregates, our own true aggregates, are in the nature of suffering, or are naturally subject to suffering, to give a rise to a wish. I want to bring this to an end. I don't want to suffer anymore. What are the origins of my suffering? What is the true or the real, actual origins of my suffering? How can I gain a cessation to my suffering? What are the mental paths I need to cultivate to gain liberation from my suffering? So this is the focus on our own lived experience. Then, when one has trained well, then one is ready to recognize this predicament that I am in is the predicament every being is in. They are all beings, all ordinary beings are suffering in this way for the same reasons. Their aggregates are true sufferings. They arise from the same origins, contaminate common afflictions, and the same solution exists for them. Their suffering can be brought to cessation through cultivating the wisdom realizing selflessness, conjoined with generosity and so forth. And then compassion will naturally arise for others who are lost in their ignorance, not recognizing there's something that can be done. And that then is the basis to develop bodhicitta. So therefore, this is a crucial point for everyone to understand. The trainings presented here, the trainings that are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity, are the preliminary practices to develop bodhicitta. Without these preliminary practices being well cultivated, bodhicitta will not be cultivated. And the preliminary practices for meditating on the 4 Noble Truths are what we have looked at, the trainings of a practitioner of initial capacity, where one develops the focus and the strength of mind to focus on the Dharma. Here, we now, in these trainings, look far more deeply. Moreover, in the practices, the trainings we've already looked at, we saw that principle, there was a cultivation of a motivation for a good rebirth, and the practices that one engaged in were those of ethics, generosity, patience, and joyous perseverance. Here, those same 4, but with added concentration, and wisdom, making 6. And those are the same 6 practices that now one trains in as when engaging in the trainings of shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity. And when one has cultivated them well and engages, develops great compassion and bodhicitta, those same practices, those same 6, one continues. Generosity, ethical restraint, patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom, they now are perfections. So therefore, these 3 groups of trainings build one on top of the other, with the one being the preliminary for the latter. To the extent the preliminary is cultivated, the latter training will come about relatively easily. To the extent the preliminary is not cultivated, the latter training cannot be cultivated. Moreover, through cultivating these sets of preliminaries, what we're looking at here and what will be built on after the bodhicitta and so forth, these are the preliminaries to engage in actual tantric practice. So this presentation that we're starting here on the 4 Noble Truths, or the 4 Truths for Aryas, it is a presentation of outstanding importance for all Buddhists. The very purpose of the Buddha's teachings was to guide beings to gain freedom from suffering. And that is the presentation here. So therefore, what we are embarking on here is of unparalleled importance. And tomorrow, we'll continue from where we've started, at the top of page 155, and continuing this slow and detailed presentation on the 4 Noble Truths. So, in our honor heart together tonight, I've explained 2 outlines. We've covered, 1 sentence, 3 lines at the bottom of a page. That's all. That's all. So, please bear with me. I know it's very slow, but what's important is that every time you leave here, your understanding is deeper. And every time that we are sitting together and you're following what has been said and you're engaging in the reflection, it's arising ever more within you. So to bring about lasting change requires slow and repeated reflection. And that's what we're doing here together.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.